Today's lecture, we are going to talk about resource use and its impact. Now, the first question that comes to mind is, what is a resource? A resource is anything that we can get from the environment that is useful and which can be consumed in a meaningful way. Now, which can be of any kind of meaning that can be given to that resource. The first and the foremost is, of course, the basic ones of survival. We need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need to take care of our children, we need to reproduce, and all this we need some basic, very basic fundamental resources. But because humans are cultural and social beings, their needs are not dictated only by biology. That is, not everything that we see in the environment that is edible. Edible from a biological point of view, edible from the point of view that it can be consumed and digested by the human body, it does not make it food. All human societies all over the world define even what is food, which is one of the most basic needs, differently. So obviously, for example, let us take a person who is a vegetarian. Now, for a person who is a vegetarian, a chicken running around is not a resource for food. Is not a resource for food. It is just a chicken that is running around. That person is not going to eat it. Similarly, there can be so many different kinds of vegetables and vegetation that grows all around us. Many of them might be edible, but people don't eat it because it does not fall within the cultural definition of what is food. Similarly, there are so many different kinds of resources that are exploitable and usable, but may not have any meaning for some people and may be very valuable for others. Like in the initial period of colonization, when the Western people met the indigenous people in South America, they found that these people were using gold as toys. It was meaningless to them. They had no value for gold. And they would get gold from them in exchange for very small, like glass beads. Even glass beads were more valuable to these indigenous people than gold, because culturally their values did not include gold as something valuable. So any part of the habitat, when we look at the natural habitat, like indigenous people, forest dwellers, today there is a lot of conflict because a lot of people who are part of the capitalist economy, they feel that underneath the forest or underneath the mountain there are minerals. That is a very rich resource for certain kind of people. But for others, it does not exist. It is not a resource. For them, the mountain is a resource as it is, maybe a deity, maybe sacred, maybe otherwise a means of their livelihood, but they do not recognize the minerals that are lying under the mountain as a resource. Then, since societies change, since cultures evolve, different kind of values come in, resources are and its uses is a dynamic concept. Because human desires and human needs change over time, as we know that today there are many things that we look around and think that this is a resource, which may be a generation back, even our own family or our own ancestors never thought were a resource. And something which they thought was a resource may not be of any use to us anymore. Like today, we don't use some of the technology that we were using earlier. We don't light lamps with oil. So that ceases to be a resource, and so many other things that have gone out of our list of needs and some new things have been added. Then what are the different kinds of resources that we can find around us? Now, when we say that we find resources in our environment, the environment itself can be defined in a multiple number of ways. Some parts of the environment is what we call as our habitat, the natural environment, the flora, the fauna, the mountains, the river, water. This is all material and tangible. But even those resources are not necessarily interpreted to be material. For example, a certain tree or a certain river is not just looked upon as a river or a tree as a source of water, but maybe as a sacred space, maybe as a deity, as something which is worshipable, or something which has a different kind of value, maybe an emotional value, a sentimental value. So then it becomes a different kind of a resource. It becomes an emotional resource. It becomes a sacred resource, and it ceases to be a material resource. Similarly, one of our primary resources, and this is something which has enabled human species to evolve the way they have evolved, is knowledge and technology. Now, we do not use the environment, the natural habitat, as it is given to us. We have ways of converting that available material which is in the raw form, and when it is not usable, into a form that is usable. Now, this is what we mean by technology. Now, it's only the human species that has technology of the kind of order that we find with us, and that is the reason why the human species is able to extract resources from a much wider range of environment than most other species. In other words, other species are adapted to specific ecological niches. So a fish can only live underwater, and it can eat whatever food is available to it in its own little ecological environment. So if we remove a particular species from its particular environment, it may not even survive in the other environment. But when we look at the human species today is surviving in almost all parts of the world, everywhere. And that is because it can transform the available resources, the naturally available resources, into useful and consumable forms through the use of technology. So, technological knowledge is a fundamental aspect of both identification of resource and its utilization. For example, it is technology that is telling people today in the contemporary world that they can go for deep sea excavations. They can look underwater for minerals, offshore drilling. Now, maybe people 100 years back did not know that there is resource that is exploitable for human use which lies under the ocean bed. They were looking for resources that were over the ocean bed. People used to go excavating for pearls, for example, or for sunken ships. That was one form of excavation. But today our technology is telling us that there is resources under the seabed as well. So, resource identification also involves a particular level of technology and of course the exploitation of it. But even more important than that, because technology is also not usable without the support of the social relationships, the social institutional mechanisms that make it possible for us to apply the technology. And a very important dimension of the human evolution is not only the discovery of technology, but its transmission and accumulation. So and this is also a technology. So there is a technology for transmission, there is a technology for accumulation. Human species made a big leap in terms of social and cultural evolution when they discovered writing, because writing made it possible to accumulate knowledge. Today, as students, as teachers, or as even laypersons, we have at our disposal enormous amounts of knowledge that were first written down, and today of course we have digital technology, so we have moved ahead in our capacity for storage, and now we are using other modes, even more efficient modes for storage than we had at disposal, which means also that the amount of knowledge that we can store is becoming bigger and bigger, higher and higher. Now coming back to the identification, even this identification in itself is not directly linked to utilization. Even amongst the simplest communities which we know as hunting, food gathering people, they also have enormous knowledge of their environment. They can identify hundreds of species of animals and plants and so many even medicinal herbs in their environment, but they may not consider all of them consumable. Why they consider all of them consumable or they do not consider them consumable depends more on culture, as I told you in the beginning of the lecture, rather than the biological dimension of their consumption. What is digestible, what is indigestible, but that is not the consideration that humans use. They use cultural. What is transmitted to them through their generation? What is conditioned by cultural values of taste? Now, if we look at international cuisine, if we look at the kind of food that is eaten all over the world, a lot of people find something that is very tasty and very considered very good food, very coveted food in some other culture as absolutely inedible. For example, in a market in Cambodia, I found that they were selling fried insects, and it is very delectable, very delicious, but since I am not used to it, or that my culture has never told me that insects and fried insects are edible, I could not eat it. So we become conditioned. This conditioning is part of what we call as a process of being brought up. As I said, knowledge accumulation depends upon transmission of knowledge. And how is knowledge transmitted? Knowledge is transmitted first and foremost through our families, through the people who bring us up, and that is what we call as the process of enculturation. So from very childhood, we are told this is something that we eat, this is something that we like, this is something that we don't eat, this is something that we should not eat. Like there are religious sanctions on food. So if you belong to a particular religion or a particular community, from childhood you are told that this is something which we do not eat. And this becomes what we say internalized. It becomes internalized to such an extent that when we grow up, even if we are given a choice and if we see other people eating those particular items, we will not be able to eat it, because for us it has become ingrained into our consciousness that this is edible and this is not. So, culture, habits and practices are most important, and they play a key role in consumption of resources, not merely in its identification. Because even if identified, somebody may have identified, and so many people identify chicken as edible, as a resource, but for a lot of people who do not eat, it is not. Milk, for example. Milk is not even in many parts of Southeast Asia. Milk is considered as non-food. And in many parts of the world, for example in the West, it is a primary food of consumption. So what are the factors that influence what we consider as resource and what we consider as consumable? Obviously one thing is availability. Now today we live in a world where because of the superior technology, everything practically is available everywhere. But culturally and cultural history tells us that not everything was available in all parts of the world. And in those places, those communities have gone through centuries, in fact millennia of history, where they have not identified something as a resource because it never existed in their environment. Now for example, if I was born in India and my ancestors have been in India, if I look at a kangaroo, I will not think that it is something that is edible, like a person in Australia would be, because I have never seen a kangaroo in my environment. So availability is one thing, and even our bodies, because evolution is also a process of genetic adaptation. Say communities who live in the Arctic region, they are conditioned to living on a purely meat or protein diet because there is nothing green in their environment. So they are probably the only human species that can survive without eating carbs and other vegetable items. And then the second aspect is technology. As I said, if you do not have the technology to exploit that particular resource, then it does not exist. And the third are needs. And needs are very conditional to culture. They are not, there is nothing called for human beings. There is an abstract level of needs, like if you are hungry, you need food. But what you need as food is purely a matter of your culture, matter of enculturation, a matter of what has been taught and what you have even picked up, because people change. I mean, it's not that people during their lifetime do not change. Just as cultures change over historical period of time, individual history also changes individuals. So people go abroad and they become non-vegetarian from vegetarian and so on and so forth. But at every point, these are the most important factors. Then, when we come to human societies, as we have mentioned again, technology is used through our economy, and economy is a set of social relationships, and social relationships are always underlined by the exercise of power. It's only in the very simple societies, what we call as egalitarian societies, where every resource is available to everyone, because most of the resources are in the nature of what we call as free goods. Like those who live in forests, everything that is in the forest is a free good. The water that is flowing in the river, the fruits that are growing in the trees, the tubers that are growing underground. But as soon as we reach a more advanced society, then we have a completely different picture. For example, look at our society. Resources are not available, they are not freely available. You cannot just walk into a store and pick up something that you want. Just like a hunter or food gatherer can simply walk around the forest and he or she can pick up what they want. If you want to drink water, you drink water. If you want to eat food, you pick up water. But if you are walking in the urban city, supposing you are walking on the streets of Delhi, you cannot get anything that you want unless you go through the channel which we call as the political economy. The economic relationships which are also controlled by the political relationships. And the first fundamental one is the control of capital or the control of certain key resources. Land was the most primary and most fundamental resource that became a controlled resource through political means. So, and then through land, everything that grew on it. So, people became landowners and they became people who were dependent on these owners of the capital to give them food, to allow them to have food. Humans, in the process of becoming more and more civilized, which is again a very conditional or critical term, but what we really mean by civilized is not that they became better, or they became more humane, or they became more logical, or they became more rational, but they became more differentiated. Differentiated means that more people were put into different slots. There were the people who controlled knowledge, there was the people who controlled land, there are people who control certain skills, and there are people who control something else, there are people who have nothing. So today's society is full of specialists, capitalists, industrialists, professionals, educationists. So what are all these different kind of specialities? These are nothing but control over certain resources. The more differentiated a society is, the more complex the society is, the more, in other words, how we have defined civilization, the more complex the civilization, the more difficult it becomes for certain people to get to resources as compared to others. Like if you go out in the market, you need, in today's market, you need something. Now if you were in a village market, if you need grain, you could go with the chicken under your arm and say, you take my chicken, I'll take your grain. But that does not happen in the New Delhi market. What you need is money. But to get to money, you need to have other resources. Like wealth, like education, like a good job, like a professional efficiency or whatever. So these have all become resources in the modern day world. So coming back to the question of civilization, it is not that when we become more complex, like if we move from a forest dwelling economy to a industrial economy, our technology is becoming superior. A superior technology is defined in terms of input and output ratio. In the sense, a more efficient technology is something which the amount that you get out is more than the amount that you are putting in. But if we look at any modern technology which is considered to be very superior, we find this is not the case. Whether it is in terms of money or infrastructure or education or knowledge or the amount of time that you have to invest in acquiring that technology, inputs are never less than outputs, they are always more. So we are not becoming more efficient. We are not even becoming more logical or more intelligent, because we know those who work with say hunting food gathering societies, the scientists, that anthropologists who work with them know that some of their technologies is so superior that even today we cannot duplicate it. Like the boomerang of the Australian Aborigines, they were considered to be among the most simple people, but their technology of the returning boomerang has not been duplicated even by the most advanced levels of knowledge of thermodynamics, which enables something that is thrown to come back to you. So we have not evolved in that way. What we have evolved is basically in terms of complexity and inequality. What is most important is that in this process of co-evolution, where the amount of technology that we are expending on the environment gets proportional to the transformation that takes place in the environment, we have now started to reach a point of where this relationship is breaking down. It is coming to a point of no return. Many of you may not know it, but 99% or more than 99% of our existence as Homo sapiens has been as hunter food gatherers, which is the simplest form of technology that we know, at least that is how we classify it. But if we look at it in terms of what today we call as sustainability, it has been that particular technology that has been sustainable, that has sustained the human species over millions of years, not just hundreds of years, but a few hundred years of industrial technology, and we find that this pressure that we are putting on the environment in terms of exploitation or the extractive technology that we are applying, which is getting more and more extractive, getting more and more exploitative, is bringing us to a brink where the transformations in the environment, that co-evolutionary process, is becoming unsustainable. In the process of evolution, we have, scholars have used the risk model. How do we tide over a risk period? That is, how do we make ourselves secure that we always have enough resources? Now, the earlier form of resource into which humans invested was in other human beings, in social relationships, in community relationships. If I have today, I will give to others, so that tomorrow when I don't have, others will give it to me. So this cooperative logic, which operated in the hunting food gathering people, in the foragers, and it operates to a large extent even today in the pre-capitalist economies, was completely given away in the modern economy, in what we call as the market economy, where it becomes a give and take situation. I give, you give, and the relationship is over. So how was the risk model being operated? In terms of accumulation, more and more accumulation, more and more accumulation. So people are never satisfied. They want more in their bank account, they want more in their storage. Nations want more in their GDPs, in their food storages, and all kinds of storage, and accumulation has become the key word for risk management. But that is not working. That is not working because we tend to go overboard. We do not have community resources, but we are depending more and more on individual accumulations. And that is where a level of destruction of the environment is coming about, which is now leading us to a very critical point of human survival. So when we think about resources, we must think more not in terms of domination, exploitation, accumulation, but in terms of coexistence. So co-evolution should mean not that one species is dominating over all others, that all are able to coexist so that we help each other to survive. So what we really need today is introspection and deep thinking about what the earth's resources and our own civilizational resources mean to us. Thank you.